Okay, good morning everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Roger. As Roger mentioned, I've been working globally in public relations for near on 23, 24 years now, and have had the fortune of working and engaging with China since 2005, and had the chance to also live in Shanghai for near on 3 years from July 2007. Our topic today is to explore the digital and social media landscape, but really in our view that to get any understanding of any aspect of the business environment in China, it's important to understand some of the macro trends that are impacting on this. And this is incredibly true of the digital and social media space. So what I'll be doing is kicking off today, just taking a couple of minutes to talk you through some of the macro trends, and then my colleague Alistair will take you through some of the key trends and makeup of the digital and social space. So as Mark mentioned before, it's impossible to talk about China without coming to some sense of the scale and the size of the country, the population, and the growing opportunities that are going to come out. And it's really interesting there, particularly looking at how that growth has been fueled over the last 5 years in particular across the country. So the Chinese government publishes its 5-year economic plans, and there's been a deliberate strategy from the government to be developing these mega cities. And this particularly took off during the economic stimulus that was introduced in 2008 in an attempt to combat the global economic crisis, where there was a significant investment in the infrastructure for the third-tier cities. And this is particularly important in the digital and social media space, because what it's done is help fuel the growth of internet and devices across the country. And as Mark was mentioning before, this has really led to a real uptake of the e-commerce opportunities across different markets around China. And what we're seeing here is in excess of 90 cities with populations over 1 million, and the top 5 cities in China have over 10 million people in them each. So significant opportunities coming from a diverse range of geographies and also demographics in the country that it's important for us to be aware of. Looking at the marketing space here, is what we see already is that the advertising and marketing spend is significant in the global stage. What's interesting though is when you break down and look at what constitutes this spend in China and how that differs around the world. So China already is the 3rd largest spender in advertising. Difficult to get figures in terms of public relations, social and digital, but let's assume that they're probably at a similar level. Already 25% of the advertising dollar is going to digital advertising, and that percentage is significantly greater than what we find in most markets around the world. Advertising still constitutes the largest spend and has 40% of the advertising dollar, but they're expecting that by 2016 is that the spend for TV advertising and digital will be the same at 33% each. So we can already see how that shift of digital spend is happening much faster in China, and will continue to escalate and outstrip the other media forms in a much faster pace than what we'll see in other markets around the world. Pace of change, so growth is important to understand in China, and not only when it comes to economic development. What we see is the rapid proliferation of new skills, of new industries, and also progress impacting in every industry, whether it be construction, aerospace, or dare I say it, the internet. When I left Australia in 2007, Facebook had just started to garner some global interest and attention. So we were just starting to see the rise of social media really hitting the global stage. Yet by mid-2008, when China was dealing with the opportunity of the Olympics, we already had a strong set of locally developed Chinese social media platforms, at least half a dozen of them, which had not only replicated the functionality of these global social media platforms, but had in many ways innovated, introduced new features, and also garnered significant populations and communities within those sites, and were in many ways leading and changing and increasing the innovation in those communities. So important to understand not only the opportunities that come with that pace of innovation and that ability to replicate, but to also understand what risks that imposes and the requirement for us to therefore always be ahead of our competitors. The piece that I think is really important to look at and understand in China, and how I think it is fundamentally different to a lot of markets around the world, is the impact of government influence and government control. And I think it's one of the things that has fundamentally impacted a lot of the cultural nuances and behaviours that exist in Chinese society and also in business. And as it applies to the internet, I think everyone is probably very familiar with the Great Firewall and the internet censorship that the government applies to try and gain some control over the conversations which are happening across this vast population. But also what's interesting is the way that the government is using the power of these social media platforms to also push its own agenda. So when I was in China, one of the things that was impacting on the country at that time was the Tibetan demonstrations. And so one of the things which really astonished me was seeing at the time of those protests, the production overnight of very emotive, strong viral video, which clearly came from the government to promote its point of view and to highlight what it had seen as inaccurate and biased reporting from the global media and the violent behaviours of the protesters. And what that video did then was utilise these channels to create a strong emotive effect within the population, and immediately garnered the support from this vast population for the government's policy, and ensured that they were able to contain any type of civil unrest that may have flowed out of that situation. The other piece that is interesting when we look at government control and how it applies to digital and social media is looking at the opportunity that has to open up and introduce new levels of authenticity and transparency which have never existed in the country. So in 2009, I believe it was, there was the government in its attempt to try and minimise the backlash against the environmental air pollution in Beijing. So I think Mark mentioned it before. It's at some horrific levels of pollution in the air quality in Beijing. And so they simply decided to stop issuing the daily readings, which highlighted the air quality in the city. And there was an immediate backlash on the social media communities, where citizens were demanding to have that information published on the internet. The populations always knew, and the citizens always knew, that that information was largely inaccurate, and there was scepticism about the validity of the results. Nevertheless, they wanted the government to have some level of transparency, and they wanted to have some level of consistent reporting that they could use to try and measure and drive improvements in policy to impact on air quality. And they were successful. And so it did take a number of weeks, and the government resisted for some time, but they were eventually forced to republish those environmental readings. The scepticism still exists around the quality of the information, but the transparency and that behavioural response from the government has certainly been appreciated. So just in summary, what we see here, if we look at some of these big forces and the macro trends that we need to consider, is that we see that China is a land of significant opportunity, but also poses many challenges that we as business professionals and marketers need to be acutely aware of. So from my perspective, and certainly from the conversations that I've had in talking to a number of our clients in China, is without a doubt, I think the most significant challenge that organisations face in China is the skills gap. So what we've seen here is the rapid growth in China has amplified the talent war, and that is really creating a lot of challenges for businesses as they're looking at escalating salaries, but also a significant gap in the skills and the talent they have available to drive the growth in their businesses. Also, what we see is the rise of the domestic players. So when multinationals entered into China some years ago, they had in many ways a very open book to work with. The local organisations were not very marketing savvy. And they certainly had very little understanding about the value of brands. And so that created a ripe opportunities for multinationals to come in and apply more sophisticated global marketing techniques. However, looking at that pace of change and the level of innovation is that clearly is no longer the case. And what we're seeing here is that many domestic players in China are increasingly sophisticated in their branding and marketing techniques and are able to, in many ways, outstrip their global players by being more locally relevant and faster and more nimble in their programs. And so that's certainly changing the landscape within China, but also what it's doing is changing the landscape outside of China, as we are seeing the rising force of Chinese players into the global stage. And I have no doubt that they will be able to quickly replicate some of the global marketing techniques that multinationals have been adopting for some time. The other piece that I think is relevant to note here is the force of the consumer dollar in China. So Chinese, as Mark was mentioning before, the Chinese population now is wealthier than it has ever been. It has access to more information than ever before, but also it has more freedom. And so, you know, a key part of the driving tourism dollar is not only because of the wealth that the Chinese have, but is because they now have the freedom to leave the country. They now have the freedom to travel with independence in a way that they never had before. And so what that means is that you have a very savvy consumer now that has access to a lot more global information, but is also very keen on ensuring, and they know the power of their dollar, and so they're very keen that their needs are met. The other piece, though, for us as international players and looking at the Chinese market is that we also need to be aware of the social issues that are emerging as a result of this. There is an increasing gap between the wealthy and the poor in the country. We are seeing the impact of the ageing population harnessed with the one-child policy, creating significant changes within the social fabric of the community. And also we're seeing the growing unrest where consumers are getting that taste of freedom. They're getting a greater awareness of the transparency and that authenticity that exists in other markets. And that's something that we as organisations need to be sensitive of when we're working there. And so the key thing really for us is to, you know, look at the opportunities and challenges in China and make sure that we're being very well considered in what we're doing, that we're partnering and ensuring that we have strong expertise to make astute decisions. So that's it from me in terms of talking about the macro case. I was going to talk through this case study here, but I'll leave that for another time because I think we're running out of time. But this is an example of a hot pot restaurant in China that has really practiced that level of, has taken the opportunity of innovation and service. And they have 75 restaurants in China, and they're about to launch in the US. So it'll be interesting to see how they take that innovation and export that globally. So something you might want to read about later. I'll switch that.